Chapter 0. When the night turned against them. The jungle was never truly silent at night. In the darkness, insects hummed. Leaves brushed against one another in the heavy air. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like distant thunder. A Japanese sentry stood at the edge of a perimeter, rifle held tight, listening for movement that might betray an enemy approach. He had been told the Americans were careless, too loud, too relaxed, undisciplined. During the day, it seemed true enough. American soldiers laughed openly. They smoked, joked, and moved without the rigid formality drilled into the Imperial Japanese Army. They looked nothing like the tightly controlled formations Japanese doctrine admired. Then the night came. It didn't begin with shouting or a reckless charge. It began with silence, an absence where sound should have been. Then came soft footsteps, barely audible over the jungle floor. A shadow moved where no shadow should have been. Suddenly, grenades detonated inside the perimeter. Gunfire erupted in short, controlled bursts. Flares ignited overhead, turning darkness into blinding white light. The American infantry appeared everywhere at once, coordinated, fast, deliberate, striking command posts, machine gun nests, supply dumps, and just as quickly as they came, they vanished back into the night. By dawn, the Japanese unit counted its losses and tried to understand what had happened. This was not the chaotic enemy they had been warned about. This was something far more unsettling. In daylight, the Americans looked casual. In darkness, they hunted. And that realization would change everything. To understand why these night attacks were so shocking, we first need to understand what Japanese soldiers believed about American infantry, and why those beliefs felt so convincing at the time. Chapter 1. The dangerous assumption. Long before the first American soldier set foot on Pacific Islands or European battlefields, the Imperial Japanese Army had already decided what kind of enemy it was facing. Americans, they believed, were not a disciplined people. Japanese military culture placed enormous value on outward order, precision drill, perfect posture, absolute obedience. Discipline was something you could see in the way a soldier stood, moved, and spoke. A unit that lacked visible rigidity was assumed to lack inner control. By those standards, American infantry appeared deeply flawed. U.S. soldiers talked freely with officers. They joked in the ranks. They slouched, chewed gum, and treated hierarchy with an informality that shocked Japanese observers. To men trained to equate discipline with ritual and restraint, this behavior looked like weakness. There was also ideology at work. Japanese propaganda portrayed Americans as soft, indulgent, spoiled by comfort. A society of abundance, it was said, produced soldiers who would crack under hardship, who would not endure hunger, heat, fear, or sustained losses. They would rely on machines and firepower because they lacked spirit. Early encounters seemed to confirm it. American units sometimes appeared disorganized on the march. They relied heavily on vehicles, radios, and supplies. Their camps were noisy. Their routines lacked the rigid ceremonial structure familiar to Japanese troops. The conclusion felt obvious. These men might be dangerous in daylight, backed by artillery and air power, but at night, when confusion ruled and courage mattered most, they would falter. That assumption was not careless, it was logical, based on Japanese experience, Japanese values, and Japanese definitions of discipline. It was also disastrously wrong, because American discipline did not look like Japanese discipline. It functioned differently, and the place where that difference became impossible to ignore was the battlefield after dark. To see why night fighting mattered so much, and why it became the proving ground for this misunderstanding, we need to step into the darkness itself and understand how war changes when the sun goes down. Chapter 2. Why the night decides everything. Daylight gives structure to war. You can see your flanks. You can read terrain. Officers can point, signals can be followed, formations can be maintained. Even chaos has boundaries when the sun is up. At night, all of that disappears. Landmarks vanish. Distances lie. A tree becomes a man becomes a shadow. Orders are harder to pass, units drift apart, and fear fills the gaps where certainty once lived. This was especially true in the environments where Japanese and American infantry clashed. Jungles swallowed sound and movement. Thick vegetation limited visibility to just a few yards. On islands and in broken terrain, darkness erased any sense of orientation. At night, a battlefield became a maze with no map. For the Japanese army, the night had long been an ally. Japanese doctrine emphasized night movement, infiltration, and surprise. Attacks after sunset were used to negate enemy firepower and technology. Darkness favored courage, endurance, and willpower, qualities the Japanese believed they possessed in abundance. For years, this belief was justified. Night assaults had broken enemy lines in China and Southeast Asia. Western forces, it was assumed, were uncomfortable in darkness. They relied on visibility, coordination, and machinery. Remove those, and they would collapse. But war does not stand still. As the conflict deepened, American units learned something critical. Night was not chaos. It was a skill. It could be studied, trained for, mastered. And while Japanese forces relied on tradition and spirit to dominate the darkness, American infantry began building a system that could function when vision failed and fear took over. When the Americans started moving aggressively at night, the balance shifted. What had once been Japanese territory, darkness itself, became contested ground. And soon, it became dangerous ground. So how did an army supposedly lacking discipline turn the night into a weapon? The answer lies not in bravado, but in a system built from training, leadership, and relentless repetition. Chapter 3. The American Night Fighting System. The American night attacks did not happen by accident. They were not acts of reckless courage or spontaneous aggression. They were the result of a system, one that looked loose on the surface but held together under pressure. At the center of that system was leadership at the lowest levels. American infantry doctrine placed enormous responsibility on non-commissioned officers, sergeants and corporals who led squads and platoons in real time. When officers were cut off, wounded, or killed, the unit did not freeze. Someone else stepped forward. Orders were simple, direct, and flexible. Rather than complex formations, American units trained to move in small elements. Fire teams knew their roles. If one part failed, another adapted. Discipline was not about standing perfectly still. It was about acting correctly when everything went wrong. Technology reinforced this approach. American units had radios down to small unit levels, allowing coordination even in darkness. They carried large numbers of grenades, flares, and automatic weapons designed for close combat. Engineers moved with infantry, cutting wire, breaching obstacles, clearing paths through minefields and jungle alike. At night, Americans did not rush blindly. They probed, they infiltrated. They isolated strongpoints, struck command elements, and withdrew before dawn. Raids were rehearsed. Objectives were limited. Success was measured not by ground taken, but by disruption inflicted. This method required discipline of a different kind. The discipline to move quietly, to hold fire, to follow timing precisely, and to retreat on command even when adrenaline demanded more. To an enemy watching from a distance, this discipline was invisible. But to those on the receiving end, it was unmistakable. Because once an army learns how to operate in darkness, there is no safe rear area. No truly quiet night. No moment of rest that cannot be interrupted. And that was when Japanese units began to experience something they had not expected at all. The theory was unsettling, but the reality was worse. The first direct encounters would leave Japanese soldiers stunned by just how wrong their assumptions had been. Chapter 4. First contact in the dark. The first night it happened, many Japanese soldiers thought it was an accident. An isolated outpost went silent. A listening post failed to report in. Somewhere along the perimeter, a brief burst of gunfire echoed and then stopped. By morning, a few men were missing, a machine gun was gone, and confusion spread through the unit. It did not feel like a battle. It felt like something slipping through their fingers. On the next night, it happened again. This time it was clearer. American infantry did not attack the strongest point. They did not rush the main defensive line. Instead, they peeled away the edges. A sentry here, a runner there, a small command dugout hit with grenades and precise fire. The attacks were short. They lasted minutes, sometimes less. There was no attempt to hold ground. The Americans struck, disappeared, and left behind unanswered questions. Japanese officers tried to impose order. They tightened discipline. They doubled sentries. They demanded absolute silence. But none of it changed the fundamental problem. The Americans were choosing when and where to fight. Each night raid forced Japanese units to react, to guess, to reposition, to stay awake. Every response burned energy. Every false alarm eroded confidence. Soldiers began firing at shadows. Ammunition was wasted. Tempers frayed. Worst of all, no pattern could be found. The Americans did not attack the same place twice. They shifted angles, timing, and approach routes. One night, it was grenades. Another night, flares and machine gun fire. Sometimes they only probed, testing reactions, learning defenses, and then they vanished. By daylight, everything looked normal again. Trenches were still manned, positions were still held, but something had changed. The night no longer felt like protection. It felt like exposure. As these attacks repeated, their true power became clear. They were not designed to destroy positions. They were designed to break something far more important. Chapter 5. The Relentless Pattern. One night raid is frightening. Two are unsettling. But when the attacks come again and again, without warning, without rhythm, without mercy, they begin to do something far more destructive than killing soldiers. They exhaust them. American night operations followed no predictable schedule. Some nights there were heavy raids, other nights only brief probes. Sometimes nothing happened at all, until just before dawn, when fatigue was at its worst. Japanese units could never be sure. Every sound demanded attention. Every rustle in the brush might be the start of another attack. Sentries stayed awake longer. Reliefs came too late. Men slept in fragments, if they slept at all. Sleep deprivation began to rot discipline from the inside. Orders were misunderstood. Tempers flared. Soldiers fired too quickly, or not at all. Junior officers lost confidence in their men. Senior officers lost confidence in their defenses. The Americans understood this effect well. They were not trying to overwhelm Japanese positions in a single night. They were applying pressure, the way water wears down stone, slowly, steadily, without stopping. Each raid forced Japanese commanders to react. Reinforcements were moved. Units shifted positions. Lines thinned in one place to strengthen another. And every adjustment created a new weakness the Americans would discover the next night. Fear compounded exhaustion. Men began to dread the darkness. What had once been a source of confidence, night fighting, became a source of anxiety. Soldiers jumped at shadows. False alarms multiplied. Ammunition dwindled. The perimeter might still exist on a map, but psychologically, it was already cracking. And in those cracks, a realization began to form, quietly, reluctantly, and impossibly late. What the Japanese were experiencing was not chaos. It was discipline of a kind they had not recognized, and it forced them to redefine what discipline in war actually meant. Chapter 6. Discipline redefined. It took time for the realization to settle in. At first, Japanese soldiers described the American night attacks as strange, effective, but somehow improper. They did not fit the mental model they had been taught. The Americans did not shout. They did not charge, screaming into the dark. They did not rely on ritual or rigid formations. They adapted. And that adaptability forced a painful reassessment. Japanese discipline emphasized cohesion and obedience. Units moved as a whole. Orders flowed downward. When communication failed, initiative often failed with it. In daylight, this system could be formidable. At night, under constant pressure, its limitations became clear. American discipline worked differently. Small units acted independently but toward a shared intent. When radios failed, leaders improvised. When plans collapsed, squads adjusted without waiting for permission. Discipline was internal, not performative, less about posture, more about judgment. Japanese soldiers began to notice the pattern. American attacks were not random. They were deliberate. Every movement had a purpose. Every withdrawal happened on time. Fire was controlled, not wasted. Men did not pursue blindly. They disengaged when ordered, even when success tempted them to stay. That restraint was unsettling. It suggested a force that trusted its training and its people, a force that did not need constant supervision to function, a force that could think in the dark. What Japanese doctrine had defined as discipline turned out to be only one version of it. The Americans had built another, one better suited to confusion, exhaustion, and decentralized combat. And once that truth became clear, another followed close behind. The enemy they had dismissed was not disorganized. He was simply operating on a different level. That misunderstanding carried a lesson far beyond the battlefield, one about how dangerous it is to judge strength by appearances alone. Chapter 7. The cost of misreading an enemy. Armies do not lose wars only because they lack weapons. They lose because they misunderstand the people standing across from them. The Japanese army did not underestimate American firepower. That danger was obvious. What it underestimated was American infantry at the most human level, the ability of ordinary soldiers to endure stress, adapt under pressure, and fight intelligently when plans unraveled. This mistake was rooted in perception. Japanese commanders judged discipline by what looked familiar: silence, ritual, rigidity, unquestioning obedience. When they saw American soldiers behaving casually in camp or speaking freely with superiors, they assumed weakness. They mistook cultural difference for lack of control. The battlefield corrected that assumption brutally. At night, when fear stripped away ceremony, American units continued to function. Orders were executed. Leaders emerged naturally. Units withdrew when they should and attacked when it mattered. The system held, and by the time Japanese forces understood what they were facing, it was too late to adjust. This pattern is not unique to war. Organizations, governments, and institutions make the same error again and again. They judge competence by appearance. They reward conformity. They overlook quiet effectiveness until it exposes them under pressure. In combat, that mistake costs lives. On the battlefield, the enemy you misunderstand is always more dangerous than the one you fear. To see the full weight of that lesson, we return once more to the darkness, where the night belonged to no one, and the cost of misjudgment was paid in blood. Chapter 8. When the night no longer belonged to anyone. The night did not favor the Japanese anymore. It did not belong to the Americans, either. It became something else entirely, an unforgiving space where mistakes were punished instantly and assumptions could kill just as surely as bullets. Japanese sentries still stood watch after sunset, rifles in hand, eyes straining into the darkness. But now, every sound carried weight. Every movement triggered fear. The night was no longer a shield. It was a threat that could strike from any direction. American infantry did not need to win every fight in the dark. They only needed to deny the enemy rest. They only needed to prove again and again that discipline does not always announce itself with ceremony or silence. Sometimes it reveals itself in restraint, in coordination, in the ability to strike, withdraw, and return the next night just as effectively. By the time the realization fully settled in, it had already reshaped the battlefield. Japanese soldiers learned that the Americans they had dismissed were not careless. They were confident. They trusted their training. They trusted one another. And most of all, they trusted a system that worked when fear was at its highest and visibility was at its lowest. That lesson came at a terrible cost. Because in war, the enemy you underestimate is the one who teaches you the hardest truths, usually when it is already too late to act on them. The night never forgot those lessons, and neither should we. Closing. Thank you for watching. Thank you for watching Witness to War. If you found this story meaningful, please take a moment to like this video. It helps these stories reach more people who care about history and its lessons. Subscribe to Witness to War for more in-depth accounts of World War II and the human decisions that shaped it. And if this story resonated with you, share it with someone who loves history or wants to understand how war really works beneath the surface. We'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from or which story you'd like us to cover next. Each story matters. Each witness matters. Thank you for being part of this journey.